Is Avatar: The Way of Water actually an animated film? The answer is a lot more complicated than you might think. Everyone agrees that the Polar Express is an animated film, so why do we not consider Avatar 2 to be animated, even though it uses a lot of the same techniques? Why does this distinction matter at all? First of all, the Academy of Motion Pictures sets a threshold for how much of a film must be animated in order to qualify as an animated feature. Can you guess what that might be? You might be inclined to guess something like 90%, which is a good guess, but it's actually only 75%. That means if you make a 3-hour movie where only 45 minutes contain live action shots, then congratulations, you've made an animated film. Honestly, this is the statistic that made me want to dive deeper into this topic at all, because by the filmmaker's own admission, Avatar 2 only contains 2 shots without any CGI elements. There's only one human character, and the rest of the characters are full CG. So why was this film not nominated for Best Animated Feature? Well, it's because there's another clause that states that motion capture and real-time puppetry are not by themselves animation techniques. This is where I disagree with the Academy. I believe that motion capture should be considered an animation technique, because the pipeline for both traditional animation and traditional performance capture are almost identical. In fact, I will demonstrate that in this video by creating the same shot twice, once using 3D animation and the other using performance capture. Broadly speaking, the pipeline for both is as follows. We start with human-driven performances, followed by a post-production refinement, and then the final rendering and compositing. The action for both shots will be a simple setup of a character turning around and being surprised by something he sees. But first, I want to thank my Patreon members for making this video possible. If you want to see videos early, as well as get your name in the credits of these videos, and see work in progress animations of my own, you can check out the link in the description, patreon.com/knowtherobot. So let's start with performance capture. In order to capture the performance and check our first box, I will be utilizing the Rokoko Smart Suit Pro 2. Combined with the smart gloves and head rig, this is an amazing tool for capturing an actor's performance in an authentic and seamless way. Huge thank you to Rokoko for sponsoring this video. So I just filmed the motion capture for the video. It's just so much fun to see your performance just one-to-one mirrored on the computer. They have a creator bundle, which gives you 40% off of the entire motion capture bundle. If you're an indie developer, you can see if you're qualified in the description by clicking the link. So thank you, Rokoko. Okay, let's get back to animating. Now, if you've seen any behind the scenes material for a film like Avatar, you might think that we can just move right on to the final rendering right away, and that our performance we've captured will be ready to render and light. You've seen something like this before. The actor is on the left and the blue person is on the right, with identical performances thanks to the power of the computer and nothing else, right? I'm pretty sure these specific promotional materials are why the Academy considers motion capture to not be an animation technique. Because if we take this at face value, the bulk of the work is already done for us. But the reality is much more complicated. The data captured by these tools are not ready to be rendered right away. In fact, there's an entire department whose job it is to modify the performance capture data and make it suitable to be rendered. This part of the pipeline is called animation cleanup, and it's essential for making performances look as good as they do in Avatar. Sometimes technology is not always perfect, and will require a human's touch to make it feel more polished. This is the next step I will need to take for this shot. I'll export this performance capture data and bring this into my 3D software of choice, Blender. This could be as simple as adjusting the performance so that the hand doesn't pass through the body. Other times it could be as complex as redoing the entire performance by hand. An actor on a soundstage will pretend to run and jump onto a flying water creature, but that performance and interaction with the CGI has to be manually created and refined in order to blend this together. Animation cleanup is a vital part of the process that deserves more recognition for all the hard work that these artists are doing. Only after this extensive cleanup process will we get performances that look as good as they do in Avatar: The Way of Water. For the purpose of this demonstration, I've revised the animation data into the performance that I, the director, am happy with. Now we can move on to the rendering phase, which requires us to create a fully CG environment for this character to exist in. After all this hard work, we are left with the first version of our shot created with performance capture. You'll notice that the movement is remarkably human, with only a slight amount of exaggeration on the movements courtesy of our animation cleanup process. Because I personally handled the frame-by-frame cleanup, I can claim authorship, having carefully sculpted and reposed every frame. So how does this pipeline differ from the traditional 3D animation pipeline? The answer is that it's remarkably similar. Animators are actors for this one simple reason. Rather than starting from scratch, the animators will film themselves acting out the scene on camera. This is a technique that goes all the way back to the early days of Disney, with artists like Art Babbitt pioneering the concept concept of reference footage. Today, it's never been easier to record reference footage on your phone. When animators record reference footage, they have to use acting techniques identical to what A-list actors are doing. And many times, animators actually take acting classes to create better reference footage for them to base their animations on. This is why Guillermo del Toro recognized animators alongside their voice actors in the credits for his Pinocchio film. He understands that animators are actors. To me, this is almost identical to recording actors in a motion capture suit. The only difference is that rather than the computer recording this reference, it's recorded by a camera. However, both performance capture and traditional 3D animation always start with human-driven performances. For the sake of our demonstration, I'll be using the footage I showed earlier of myself acting out the scene in the mocap suit as my reference footage, so we can check that first box. Now we move on to post-production refinement, which for traditional 3D animation is where a majority of our work will be done. This process takes much longer than performance capture because we are recreating this performance by hand, frame by frame. Where the performance capture shot took roughly 6 hours from the recording of the footage to cleaning up the data, using traditional 3D animation took me a few days to nail down this shot. Obviously, the motion capture suit gives us a much quicker version of this shot, though it does lock us into a human-looking performance, because I'm a human. If I want to exaggerate the reaction of the character, for example, I will need to manipulate this by hand to cartoonify this performance. But with traditional 3D animation, this is part of the process anyway. This part involves adjusting character arcs, exaggerating poses, and adjusting the performance in the same frame of mind as motion capture cleanup. Both are frame-by-frame artistry when they're done correctly. We can now check that second box in this row. For the last stage, the pipeline becomes identical to the performance capture pipeline. We once again have to create a fully CG environment for the character to exist in. Many times, the environment will take up a majority of the frame and might even overshadow the character's animation. The pipeline for adding visual effects elements is identical, as well as lighting, compositing, and the final render. After all this hard work, we can finally check this box and look at our shots side by side. Determining which version of the shot is better depends on what you're going for as an artist. The motion capture suit version gives a great performance because the character is humanoid and is designed to move like a human. If I wanted a more cartoony, exaggerated version of the shot, I might choose to go with the traditional 3D animated version. It really just depends on what my artistic intent is for the story that I'm telling. Which brings us to our final points. Why does any of this matter? At this point, you might be thinking that I'm splitting hairs, trying to say that motion capture and traditional animation should be considered two sides of the same coin, and that both are valid animation techniques. But seriously, who cares? After all, the Polar Express just feels like an animated film, and Avatar 2 feels like a hybrid film with CGI. Why is the logic of this distinction worth dissecting? I believe this distinction does matter. How can we say that motion capture is not an animation technique when we accept that rotoscoping is? Films like Loving Vincent depend on human-driven performances for the artists to go in and refine frame by frame with rotoscoping. Meanwhile, Rango is universally considered an animated film, even though the reference footage was acted out by A-list talent, no different in essence from what's happening in Avatar. And if the distinction is that Avatar is more photorealistic than an animated film with the same pipeline, like the Polar Express, then I'd like to point to how the 2019 Lion King has been acknowledged years later as animation, despite also striving for photorealism. Hollywood often downplays the animation aspect of these hybrid films, in my view, to avoid the stigma of being called a kids movie, because as soon as it's labeled animation, the audience will automatically associate it with it being a film for kids. They won't take the film seriously the way they do with Avatar: The Way of Water, even if the exact same pipeline was used to create the Polar Express. They will disguise animation with big-name directors, Hollywood A-list actors, and photorealistic art direction in order to call it a hybrid film so that it can have a PG-13 rating and qualify for Best Picture at the Oscars.
And we need to thank our families.
When we refer to these films as hybrid films, I believe it downplays and ignores a huge team of animators and artists who are shaping the performances frame by frame with the same level of care that animators at Pixar have. I think that we in the animation community should be embracing films like Avatar 2, because animation is a medium, not a genre. It's a way for artists to tell their stories in a way that they can't do in live action. I would argue that we should expand the definition of animation to include these hybrid films to celebrate the artistry rather than disguising it with shady marketing techniques. Claiming that motion capture is not an animation technique does more harm than good, and I hope by challenging this definition, we can learn to embrace animation as a valid vessel for storytelling. Do you think that these films should be considered animation, or do you think that the marketing departments of these studios are correct to say that they're hybrid films? Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. And if you want to learn more about animation, you need to watch this video where I talk about all the details that went into the creation of Across the Spider-Verse. Until next time, thank you for watching.